everybody. Thank you for coming. Okay, so what I want to talk to you today, I hope you all have your moleskins out, is that deadly blank page, and how it can be so intimidating to young and old artists and writers alike, and it can cause people to be paralyzed to make decisions. And so I'm here to kind of confess how little a plan I tend to have when I start making something, and how literally that first mark becomes forgotten and buried under so many other marks. But sometimes you're lucky and you get an idea and it comes in a flash. But what do you do between those moments of inspiration? You can't just sit around and wait, so you have to get to work. So for me, I want to focus this talk on kind of the beginnings of the idea, just where it starts and how I've learned to trust the blank page and how to put less stress on that decision. So I was born in Aleppo, Syria, and I moved to Ohio when I was 5 years old. So I went from the Middle East to the Midwest. And as a teenager, I would return to the Middle East occasionally. And on one of my visits to Lebanon, I went to this cave, and it was definitely the biggest interior space that I had been in outside of Belden Village Mall. Not as charming. Nothing in Ohio was nearly as charming or as old as this, although I was used to big, expansive spaces. But this gave me a kind of flash of inspiration. I thought, I really want to make installations. I want to make environments and spaces that you can inhabit. I wasn't really interested in making clay objects that sat on a pedestal. So when I got back, I stapled together these paper plates, and I was in a kind of an experimental art space. And you would walk through this room and end up in this kind of cavernous paper plate cave. So again, I'm working with a flat material and creating a contoured environment, so turning something flat into something round. I actually stole this idea from my mom. So this is me wearing my mom's paper plate Halloween costume when I was a kid. She won me a lot of awards. So fast forward, moving to New York City, I could no longer kind of count on these experimental spaces, these art spaces, and I couldn't kind of depend on a wall. I didn't always know where the work was going to go, but I did have to then focus my attention on the floor and think of the floor as a kind of blank page. So here I still needed a plan. It was kind of the earlier years, so I needed a little bit more instruction. And I decided to put paint on the soles of my feet and dance the waltz. And wherever my footprints landed, those became the kind of the blueprint for the sculpture. So that would tell me where to plant the spire of the cathedral. And then I started to look at the interiors of these cathedrals and these big religious spaces, which also were kind of like caves. And I realized, well, there's quite a lot of blueprints to be used. So I became obsessed with this one pattern. And I really loved these kind of unraveling walls. I use this as the basis for a lot of, or a few works, namely this one called the Tower of Infinite Problems. So these were relatively large sculptures, but they were massive, and all the materials that I used were opaque, but they always started off flat. So I'd use kind of, you could see cardboard. Is there a laser pointer? No. You could see cardboard and like fiberglass membranes, and in this case, honeycomb. But they were always opaque. You could always see through them, so I never wanted to kind of enclose too much space. And you can see that's the basis of that labyrinth. But eventually I wanted to not depend on a floor plan. So I started instead to rely first on an image. Again, another flat starting point that I would turn into something round. And I was obsessed with this painting by Peter Bruegel. This is the Tower of Babel. And of course, the Tower of Babel is interesting because I love the story of origins, and it's a story of the origin of language. So I use this as a starting point for a body of work. And these are, again, sculptures that have a kind of precarious relationship with the floor. They don't rest kind of politely on the floor. They look like they're kind of trying to lift off the ground, or they're failed attempts to lift off the ground. But I still realized that I was avoiding something. Even though my work tended to reference the body, I was still avoiding figuration. So I decided to pin another kind of image on the wall, and I printed out this beautiful marble, kind of luscious, figurative carved sculpture, and I pinned that on the wall, and I used that, the kind of sumptuous folds of the fabric, as the outline to weld the body of this figure. So I kind of extruded those folds into a figure. You can kind of see it there, but as you walk around, you kind of lose the dimensionality because I was just working with a piece of paper. So again, I tried to work with figuration. Again, you can see at the top there's a kind of a shell of a reclining female form, and she kind of unravels to the midsection, which is kind of my pedestal, but it's a outline of a spiral galaxy. And then again, this is the figure at the top. And then again, I decided to deal with the figure head on. Now, this time I was introduced to a new material, which is bronze, and I thought that I really had to rethink my process and rethink how I work. So suddenly the pedestal seemed like something I could use. And here, the pedestal and the figure fit hand in glove. It was really another way that I could kind of corrupt a classical form. And finally, this was sort of a breakthrough piece for me. Finally, I felt like I could really use the pedestal in my work. But now, rather than using it as like a display, I thought I would start there. I would use it instead of something that happens at the end. It would be the beginning of a piece. So here, I started with the pedestal in the front. You can see this kind of square object, and it would kind of dissolve as you walked around the sculpture, and it would hold up these two figures and this landmass above it. And then I made another piece in which I used two figures. You can see one at the top and one on the left. So in this case, I started with a cluster of pedestals, which is there. And standing here, I imagined you would be the third figure in the triangle. So the piece kind of really opened up and expanded. But again, I didn't have a plan for how this started. I really just saw this massive pedestals and decided to cut a section out of it. And I sort of found a trace of a line floating through it. And I used that to anchor the mountains and the landscape that would kind of grow after. So you can see here, this is where you would stand to kind of triangulate the position, the triangle, and this is one of the figures again. Still thinking about figures in terms of planes and as a kind of a shell. And then they start to get bigger, and they start to get kind of outside of my visual periphery. So here, gaining a little more confidence with figuration, I use this cluster of much bigger cluster, these massive figures. It was kind of like a small population. And they floated above this cityscape below. And they were kind of entangled in these mountains and pyramids. And everything, again, is just built with these planar forms. So I would build these for years sometimes. Like I think this one took 2.5 years or something like that. And it would become kind of difficult to remember what that first mark was, what that starting point was. But occasionally, it was easy to remember. In this case, this is a piece that was kind of haunted by this one painting. It was a Spanish Gothic painting that I saw at the Prado, and I decided to isolate this section, this cloak, and kind of outline the ornament, strictly the ornament, and extrude it to create this form, which in my mind, I don't know, my thinking initially here was to kind of separate the image from the texture or the material of the painting. So the colorful drips behind would kind of be used as these building blocks and separate from the imagery. So once I figured out this process, this was another kind of breakthrough moment. This was these drips of color that would dry and float kind of suspended midair, and I would reinforce them. And then I realized that once I figured out how to do this, that it opened up another body of work for me. And this time, it brought me back to the wall, and it brought me back to flatness. So here I'm making these flat materials and using them to create something large and round and dimensional. But I realized I could also treat them similar to the fresco. The drips are actually kind of tinted color inside wet plaster. So I would make this piece on another wall, and I would paint it and then bring it over to the gallery and cut out a big hole. So this was a big hole cut out here, and it would kind of construct it to fit inside the wall and then seam it all together. So this was kind of like an architectural intervention. But without a big wall to cut into each time, I still wanted to make these. So I made them as hanging panels, which is the kind of last 2 years of work. I've been making these hanging panels. And sometimes the reference is really blurred and you can't really tell the source. And sometimes there's a faint hint of where the source might have come from. Sometimes I make it up. Sometimes it's kind of a composite. But what's kind of important to remember is that they might look like they're kind of laser cut or machine cut, but they're all handmade. And the openings here are areas that have not been painted, so they're not actually cut out. They're just kind of openings that the reinforcement didn't capture the image. So I do these flat. It's an easy way to think about it is that the image kind of comes first, and the connective tissue, which is the canvas in a sense, comes after. The image and the structure are essentially laminated together. And you can kind of simultaneously see the image, but then be reminded that it's a dimensional object because you can see through it. And you can kind of see the textures and the drips and the surface up close. And then from far away, you can kind of see something different. But I still was making sculpture. I'm still making sculpture. This is a piece that was at the Vienna Secession. It's called Phantom Limb. And I returned again to starting with this series of stacked boxes that dissolved, and then also using this single figure. Again, now it had been a while, I was always using these clusters of figures, but I decided to kind of salvage this one figure that was used for a mold for a previous sculpture. So I gave it kind of new prominence and set it on top. It had actually, the limbs had come off as I had used it on a previous work. And I created this kind of mountainscape with caves and kind of sinkholes and other cavernous spaces. Then it connected to this raft over here that with the phantom limb kind of trailing behind. So this was another opportunity to make an inset wall piece. So it's bracketed by these two panels. This one uses this Memling painting in part. It's this kind of woman. It's just the weirdest painting. It's a woman kind of grafted into the top of this mountain, kind of cloistered in. She looks really comfortable and polite. And you can kind of see a faint Tower of Babel again. This is the back. And this one is from the story of Gradova, which is another kind of little obsession of mine. Her feet lift off the ground. And this show closed last week in LA. This was another kind of inset wall piece, and it divided the space in half, and you could literally walk through it. So it was kind of like an opening, like the mouth of a cave. And it's actually kind of hard for me to talk about my recent work because I really haven't figured out what it's taught me. It's much easier, and this is why I'm talking about the starts of things in this conversation, because it's harder to talk about what a piece is and what it means. And it's much easier to talk about what kind of started the piece in the first place. So I won't have too much to say about the show, but I thought I'd show you some images. You know, the stuff that matters anyway comes up later. Anyway, it's easy not to try not to overthink about things and try to keep your head like a little more like a little kid. So, thank you very much.